My name is Michelle Davis. I'm a supervising architect at the Division of the State Architect. And I'm delighted to be here today, so thank you for having me. And we're going to talk about circulation paths and chapter or section 11B 250 in the California Building Code. As Jeff said, we have some learning objectives today. We're going to understand some definitions and terms used. And we're going to talk about the requirements for circulation path in locations with vehicle traffic. We're going to understand some exceptions that have been provided for existing facilities and learn the correct use of detectable warnings. I think it's very important that you all know that the rules laid out in the building code are there to empower you to think about how pedestrian and vehicle traffic move within your sites. The message that detectable warnings sends to people who are blind or visually impaired is important. It's important for you to understand that. And I want you to know how you can leverage that knowledge into a safer, more attractive circulation for everyone. As you listen today, keep in mind that section 11B 250 was written with new construction in mind. It was intended to be an improvement over what we had, because what constituted a hazard was subjective. On existing sites, there are going to be plenty of situations where black and white clarity in applying this section may not happen. And we at DSA understand as an enforcement entity also that we're going to have difficulty with some issues on these sites as well. But I'm here to educate you about circulation paths, detectable warnings, and hopefully empower you to design these sites responsibly. So circulation paths were added as a new section 11B 250 in the 2019 interim CBC supplement. There were no additional changes made for the 2022 CBC. So everything I'm talking about today would apply to both of those codes. And this session does qualify for California specific training for those who are looking for your CASP renewal units. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So the first thing I want to point out is that the word hazard, or the term hazardous vehicular area, is no longer used. That section was taken out. As I said, the word hazardous was subjective. I myself had a fair number of debates about that concept. And it was not being applied consistently by either designers or local jurisdictional entities. The concept between the old hazardous vehicular area requirements and the new circulation path requirements are similar. The old section uses language about a pedestrian path adjoining vehicle routes, and the new section uses the word contiguous, and adjoin and contiguous are synonyms. So they're both essentially calling for the same type of separation of pedestrians and vehicles. Let's start by taking a look at the changes made to definitions of terms related to the circulation paths, because as you all know, words do matter. Blended transition, a raised pedestrian crossing, depressed corner, or similar connection that has a grade of 5% or less. That grade specification was new. Between a circulation path and a level of a sidewalk or walk and the level of a vehicular way. Blended transitions are similar to curb ramps in the same way that ramps and sloped walking surfaces are similar. The primary difference is the slope of the surface. A blended transition has a lower slope than a curb ramp. Definition for circulation path itself is an exterior or interior way of passage provided for pedestrian travel, including but not limited to walks, sidewalks, hallways, courtyards, elevators, platform lifts, ramps, stairways, and landings. You'll notice that the definition of circulation path does not include the term accessible route. An accessible route can certainly be part of a circulation path, but a circulation path does not have to be an accessible route because stairways are not part of an accessible route either. So they're a little bit different. Hold on while we get the slide moving forward. Thank you. So drive aisles and driveways were both newly defined terms in the 2019 CBC. Drive aisle was defined as a vehicular way provided within a parking facility that connects vehicular entrances, parking stalls, electric vehicle charging stations, passenger loading zones, and vehicular exits. A driveway is a vehicular way providing access between a public way and a building, parking facility, or other off-street area. A driveway may provide access to drive aisles in a parking facility. I think you're starting to see that each one of these terms has very specific definitions. Not defined in Chapter 2 are a couple other words that we need to understand. And the first one of that is the word crossing. A crossing is a place or structure, as on a street, where pedestrians or vehicles cross. We know, of course, that if a word isn't defined, we use standard collegiate dictionary. I'm not going to read all three of these on the screen here. Those are just three separate dictionary definitions. But it's important to understand that the crossing is specifically that section or the points where the pedestrian route and the vehicular route cross each other. It does not extend past that area of intersection. That becomes something else. Both vehicles driver and pedestrians are expected to use caution before moving through a crossing. Contiguous. It's another word that we don't hear too often, but yet it shows up in 11C250. Contiguous means being in actual contact, touching along a boundary. Cambridge says next to or touching another. The Free Dictionary, sharing an edge or a boundary. So California is contiguous to Nevada. Slide, please. And finally, accessible route hasn't changed at all, but I did wanted to review that real quick and point out that an accessible route by definition is a safe route. It's highlighted there in red. Safe for and usable by persons with other disabilities. The language is not a recent change. It's been in the code for a long time. And you'll note that a crosswalk is included in this definition of accessible route. So in terms of a crossing, the path is presumed safe because you're going to make sure it has the appropriate warnings. The term blended transitions itself is not new. But its placement at 11B247 was new with the interim 2019 CBC. what's important to understand here is that people with visual impairments may not be able to distinguish between a blended transition and the regular walking route because a blended transition does have that lower slope. It's not a ramp. So at blended transitions, we need detectable warnings to ensure the transition from a vehicle area to a circulation path or accessible route area is obvious. Next slide. So what is a detectable warning? It's a standardized product that's used to warn of hazards on a circulation path. And what do detectable warnings provide the end user when they're encountered? Detectable warnings say stop or pause, listen, verify your surroundings are safe to proceed. They're intended to provoke an action and a determination by the pedestrian. In effect, they are a switch on or off, safe or hazardous, but they are not a switch found in pairs like many people think. It doesn't necessarily have to be one side of the crosswalk or the other, because that may not always be appropriate. It's one side of the detectable warning itself versus the other. It's at that point, the person needs to pause and take notice of their surroundings. So what section 11B 250 is doing is it's requiring that designers really understand how these detectable warnings are used and what they communicate. To create safe, effective circulation paths, designers need to reconsider how their designs work and understand how a site is arranged. That's going to be critical to your success. The tools for a safe, attractive site are still there, but it's going to require some thought and consideration on your part. Remember that 11B 250 was written with new construction in mind. As I said before, keep in mind that the overuse of detectable warnings actually decreases the usability of the circulation path by people who are blind or visually impaired. Detectable warnings are not going to go away in the California building code, so just learn to design well with them and use them to create consistency in the built environment. So we realize this section is a shift in how we think and design, and hopefully I can guide you through that shift a little bit today. So the first part of 11B 250 tells us that circulation paths contiguous, meaning right up against, vehicular traffic shall be physically separated from vehicular traffic. And that includes the travel through parking facilities, in and out of parking spaces, electric vehicle charging spaces, along roadways, driveways, drive aisles, all those vehicle areas. We want pedestrians separated. Then it goes on and it says that the physical separation shall be provided with circulation paths raised 4 inches minimum above the area where vehicular traffic occurs. So where this circulation path is directly bordering a traffic use, the priority is to provide a pedestrian level that is raised above the vehicle level by a minimum of 4 inches. This 4-inch high circulation path is a priority because that's the way the world already exists. We have existing sidewalks and curbs, and this is what we're all used to encountering. If the circulation path is separated from the vehicular traffic by a landscape area or some other element, then it's no longer contiguous to that vehicular traffic. So you can separate either vertically with the 4-inch curb, or you can separate horizontally by placing some other element in between. We've purposefully left out what methods of separation might be acceptable though, other than that 4-inch vertical, because it could vary depending on site-specific considerations. What separation is acceptable is going to be up to designers and building officials. We did also purposefully leave out railings because they're problematic for 2 reasons. First, if the spacing is wide enough, a guide dog can go right through them. And then the person with the visual impairment following that dog is stuck. So obviously that is a big problem. And then second, the railings and vehicles tend not to mix very well. The railings get hit, they get broken, there's sharp metal until somebody gets around to fixing it. It just doesn't work well together.
Yeah.
Yes.
Costco didn't lobby against this.
No, I got no comments from Costco in the record, which I did check before I did this. And actually, if you also read some of the access board statements on railings, the primary reasons why there aren't rails or handrails required at curb ramps was because of that problem with vehicular traffic and vehicles angling the rails. So this section is a shift, and it's going to require all of you to use some thoughtfulness and your design skills to achieve the goal of a safe route. So this is an image where it's the old way of doing things. You know, you'd have a driveway, you didn't worry too much about how people got into the building. Maybe they walked up the driveway in proportion across the access aisle and into the building. And this is not going to be permitted under 11B 250. The intent is for vehicles and pedestrians to be separate. There are obviously those cases where there's crossings or transitional spaces, and that's fine, but we want to design those areas carefully. Now, it's important for me to tell you the ADA standards do not make the distinction that the CBC is making. So in alterations to existing facilities, something like this might be permitted to remain. It's certainly not a safe route. In new construction, though, we want to shift our preconceived notions and design it so there's a hierarchy of safety and access. An element is either vehicular oriented or it's pedestrian oriented. It can't be both. One always takes precedence. So design the walkway areas separate from the vehicular areas. Next slide. 11B 250 comes with 6 exceptions, which is quite a few for a code section. The first one, I think, is pretty obvious. It covers the connectors between the circulation path and the vehicle areas. And those connectors are either a curb ramp. Remember, that's the 5.1 to 8.33% slope, or the blended transition, 5% down to 0 slope. Those connectors require a warning to the pedestrian. So we said detectable warnings are a signal that the environment is changing and the pedestrian needs to pause and assess the area. Next slide. Option 2 seems to be causing more confusion. First, note that it only covers circulation paths in the public right of way, not interior to the site. At the locations covered, the vehicle is crossing the pedestrian route, not the other way around. The pedestrian has priority at those locations. It was not intended that pedestrians that are using cane navigation pause at every driveway down the street to ascertain if a vehicle is coming out of the driveway. We want the pedestrian to move smoothly down the street. Next slide. Here we have an image. This image on the screen is showing that darker concrete area in the front is a driveway. And then there's about 20 feet where we have the tree on the street side and a planter box on the property side. And then there's another driveway, a wider one this time, with cars going in and out. Then there's more tree and planter box areas, a third driveway. And you can see that very quickly, detectable warnings at each side of these driveway locations wouldn't be useful. They would get very confusing very quickly. You would never know if it was safe or dangerous, and it just would not communicate a useful message. So there are going to be existing conditions where there's going to need to be some judgment used. These particular driveways do not have stop signs. If the owner wants to install a stop sign, you might have to design something different because maybe they need a curb ramp going down. Maybe then the vehicle takes priority. It's just going to depend on your existing site. The regulations are not designed to be responsive to bad design. So they can't cover every condition. The intent of the code and the language used in each section has to be applied to make an interpretation. Next slide. No, whoops. That one. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Sorry. Exception 3, the first part of exception 3 is covering the crossing itself, where circulation paths cross driveways or drive aisles. It's not covering the curb ramp or blended transition at the end of that crossing point. Remember how I said that the crossing was just where the two types of traffic intersect? We don't want vehicles driving across the detectable warnings. They're not designed to withstand that kind of wear and tear. We don't want crosswalks defined by 2 rows of detectable warnings. That would not be helpful. It would not communicate the correct message. And the second sentence of exception 3 is confirming that the circulation path doesn't have to be raised if it's serving only accessible vehicle transitional areas, those accessible parking, accessible charging. We don't need the circulation path to go up and down. We don't need to design a roller coaster there. So my friends at Calvo have provided me with these sketches, and I liked them enough that I included a couple in this presentation today. This shows 2 examples of exception 3, where there is a curb ramp that's going down. There is a drive aisle crossing. The crossing is not marked in this case, which is fine. It's not required to be marked. And then the route leads only to accessible parking spaces. So detectable warnings aren't needed on the other side either. You're 100% in a vehicular area at this point. Next slide. Okay, well, what if it's new construction and you're trying to get that route out to the public right of way? Then you have to design it a little bit differently, and you're going to have to think about it a little bit differently. So if the circulation path in new construction extends through the parking to the public way, as shown on the left side, the circulation path will need to be raised 4 inches above the vehicle level. A curb ramp or sloped blended transition would be provided at both ends of the crossing. In this case, I've shown the painted crossing, but again, it's not required. But it can be part of good design, and does serve to warn drivers that pedestrians might be in the area. At the parking area on the right, the crossing leads only to the accessible parking spaces. So again, no raised circulation path is required. Next slide. Exceptions 4 and 5 are telling designers to plan for safe, separate pedestrian routes. However, exception 4 does acknowledge that in existing facilities, there could be existing constraints that may prevent raised circulation paths. And it does allow the alternative to use detectable warnings to create those circulation paths. Exception 5 is confirming that access aisles are more closely related to the vehicle spaces than they are to circulation paths. And sections 11B-502.4 and 11B-503.4 actually support and prohibit placing detectable warnings in access aisles. And finally, exception 6. This is similar to exception 5 because the area that's needed to maneuver around charging equipment, it's electric vehicle charging stations that are accessible. The maneuvering space around that charging equipment is more closely associated with the vehicle use than it is with the pedestrian use. And that maneuvering space needs to be at the same level in order for it to be useful. And detectable warnings wouldn't be helpful in that area. And I've got an image on the next slide. Yeah. And so you can see here that the circulation path at the same level as the parking and charging equipment does not have detectable warnings, but it does have a parallel curb ramp that has the detectable warnings appropriately on that surface. And that leads up to a raised walk. As I said, the charging equipment has to have the maneuvering space around so somebody can park their electric vehicle and get to the charging port. The electric vehicles, where the charging ports are located, how much maneuvering space you need is not standardized. And so we don't know how much maneuvering space they're going to be. So we're leaving plenty of room for cars to be parked in different manners so that they can get charged. So we've made some other changes to code sections that reference detectable warnings, and I've referred to them a little bit earlier, but I want to go through them now and give you the full picture. Detectable warnings, as I said, a standardized surface feature built in or applied to walking surfaces or other elements. The change was that we specified persons with, they're there to warn persons with visual impairments of hazards on a circulation path. Apparently there was confusion that they might be for something else, but they are not. They are there just for a warning. Next slide, please. So there were some changes to the technical requirements of detectable warnings. The language that divided the detectable warnings into two groups. If you were reading that section really closely, I know all of it. There was two sections. Ones that where detectable warnings were used at boarding platforms, bus stops, hazardous vehicular areas, reflecting pools, track crossings. And then there was this other nebulous other areas section. Those two areas have both been removed. Additionally, the color is limited to yellow in new construction. And I know that's going to disappoint a lot of you, but yellow is one of the most visible colors. And it is one of the last colors that people with certain deteriorating vision conditions lose. So it's the color that as we age, we can see the longest. So it provides the highest level of safety. Next slide. So I skipped over a couple of exceptions in the previous slide. There are two exceptions to what I just said about the yellow color. And that is where you are replacing less than 20% of detectable warnings that were already approved and installed in a location, or where alternate colors were previously approved and installed. You don't have to just change the detectable warnings out to yellow just because the code changed. So if you have a different color installed, it can stay. Next slide. So there's a number of places in the as well where the language was changed to specifically state that detectable warnings are not permitted. I'm going to run through these real quick here for you right now. There's quite a few. There was some debate about whether detectable warnings constituted a change in level. So we needed some more clarity. And we made changes at multiple locations. 11B 304.2 covers turning spaces. So your turning circle, your turning T, no detectable warnings permitted there. Next slide. Any wheelchair clear floor areas, the 30 by 48 inch wheelchair space, no detectable warnings permitted there. And next slide. Doors, maneuvering spaces at doors, doorways, gates, remember outside gates. They 11B 404 and 405 does not permit detectable warnings within the door maneuvering clearances or at ramp landings. So if you have a regular ramp, we don't want to see detectable warnings at the top, intermediate, or bottom landings. There will need to be more space if you have to warn somebody of a hazardous condition. Next slide. Section 11B 502.4 confirms that detectable warnings are prohibited at parking spaces and access aisles. As I said earlier, that is a vehicular area. It's a transitional space. And 11B 503.4 prohibits detectable warnings at vehicle pull-up spaces and access aisles at passenger drop-off and loading zones. They may be required at a curb ramp or blended transition beyond those access aisles, but they're not allowed in the vehicle areas in those transitional access aisle areas.
So you,
Next slide. Yeah.
see, if you have a drop-off area, you don't want to put detectable warnings?
So the question, if in case anybody online didn't hear it, if you have a drop-off area, you don't want detectable warnings. Correct, you do not. You want the drop-off area to be at one level, and then you have a raised circulation path adjacent to that, and either a blended transition or a curb ramp, and that's where you would put your detectable warnings.
Just seems counterintuitive.
Well, that's where the shift in the way we have to think comes in. So this is a shift in how we design. We're trying to keep vehicles very separate from pedestrians. And yes, there's those transitional spaces, but we want them well marked.
So all these retail places that have these drop-off or the front lower, that's level with the drive aisles, and they all have these detectable warnings at the edge of it, that's a no-no now.
The retail spaces with the drop-offs. Well,
Well, they're kind
you
of,
have to look at a plan, but they probably want to design a real drop-off rather than kind of thoughtlessly plopping the building down and making everything level and then putting a sea of detectable warnings.
what's for carts.
Well, we want to keep cars separate than people. Next slide. So tread surfaces, detectable warnings are not allowed on stair treads either. And they are also not allowed at wheelchair seating spaces within assembly areas. Nor are they permitted at electric vehicle charging spaces and their access aisles. So it's pretty consistent through the code where they're not allowed to be. Couple other changes that happened in the interim code update to parallel curb ramps. They were clarified to allow that a parallel curb ramp can have either one or two exits. The detectable warnings at the parallel curb ramps are handled a little bit differently than a perpendicular curb ramp or a ramp landing. The parallel curb ramp by design requires a turn at the bottom. So placing the detectable warnings on the slope surface doesn't provide the correct warning information. Since the detectable warnings are generally not allowed at landings, though, they can be problematic for wheelchair users to turn on. A compromise was made that allows some landing area that's clear for mobility device users who need to reposition. And then there's also adequate warning at the appropriate location for people with visual impairments. The configuration provides a way for the mobility device user to also pass through if they are not making the turn. And an additional constructability change was made to allow those detectable warnings to be held back from the face of the curb. They can be 6 to 8 inches back, and this allows for the joint that's typically provided between the curb pour and the face of the sloped surface. And that way, if there's any uneven settlement, it's not going to lift the detectable warning pad as well. Next slide. Diagonal curb ramps were not changed, but I did want to point out that they do still require wheelchair clear spaces at the top and bottom, in addition to the detectable warnings on the sloped face. Next slide. Okay, and we're almost to the end here. I've got a few examples because, next slide, please. I've been getting a lot of questions about parking garages. So since I've been getting quite a few questions, I thought I'd try to answer some right off. And I want to point out that the answer to the same question can vary here, depending if it's an existing facility or new construction. So I've been asked a few times about a configuration that's similar to what's on your screen. It's a parking facility with an elevator and a stair in the corner. Short answer is yes. It was the intention for pedestrians and vehicles to be separated, even in parking facilities, in parking garages. Especially if there is a specific pedestrian route provided. Remember that 11B-250.1 exception 4 allows the separation to be provided by detectable warnings in existing facilities, but there could be other options as well, depending on what the layout of the building is. This example shows what we are used to seeing prior to the adoption of 11B-250, and the elevator and the stair are in the corner. There's a lobby space of sorts, but it's at the same level and there's no separation between the vehicle spaces and the pedestrian route. Some facilities might install bollards, but they protect building elements more than they protect people. So those aren't considered protection for a pedestrian route. Next slide. So in my second example here, the grouping of the stair and the elevator in the corner makes a natural circulation route. Other circulation routes may or may not be provided in the facility, just depending on what other features are located on each level, such as connections to other buildings or the location of accessible parking or charging spaces. In the example here, if this is new construction, and the design team wanted to keep the field of view open, they might want a raised circulation path. And it would be relatively easy to connect the elevator, stair, and pedestrian route at the head end of the parking stalls. The entire pedestrian area can be raised 4 inches, parallel curb ramps installed at the access aisle to the accessible parking spaces, and the raised circulation route can continue beyond to other parking spaces. Next slide. If a similar configuration happens at an existing facility, though, it could be a little bit more of a challenge. It may not be possible to provide that raised pedestrian route, so other methods might need to be considered. In my drawing here, I've shown a low concrete masonry unit wall between the first accessible parking space and the elevator lobby area. That provides a break so that the vehicle area is no longer contiguous to the pedestrian area. And that means that the designers wouldn't need to use as many detectable warnings to keep them separate. If there's no defined circulation path at the head end of the stalls, then parking spaces are right up against the outside wall. Then detectable warnings could be placed at the opening of the concrete masonry unit wall and transition the signal to the vehicle area at that point.
Michelle,
Yes.
doesn't that become more of a hazard to have a wall next to where the driver's trying to get out and got?
This is an example. Well, it depends on how high the wall is. If the wall is a hazard. Okay, so I was thinking, 3-4 feet high. So definitely tall enough that nobody's going to trip on. But I'm not trying to promote a method of doing it here. I'm just trying to say, if you install something else in between the vehicle and the pedestrians, it's no longer contiguous. So think about what elements you might be able to use that could provide that level of safety for the pedestrians.
Sure. Minimum height to that? Like, could you just do like a curb? Or does that have to be a?
And I think that's where we're going, is that a curb could be a trip hazard. So this is again where designers' good judgment is going to be needed. And that was the end of my formal presentation. So it sounds like you have questions. So
At the driveways, you're talking about continuing of the walking paths. If the intent is not to have the truncated devices as you're going across a driving path, what if that walking path curves around a curved drive? How would a person who's blind know that they need to turn?
well, so the question is, if the pedestrian route curves around a drive area, how would a blind person know they have to turn? If the pedestrian route is raised, they're going to feel the curb. That's what makes it that much safer. So there's a curb there that is cane detectable.
No, I mean the driveway is coming up, levels out, and it's flat across.
So the driveway comes up to meet the public right of way?
The driveway comes up to meet the parking area. So it's coming off the street and it's curved. I'm thinking like over by Safeway, right? Like you walk around a curved entry into a parking area.
I'm sorry, I'm not picturing what you're talking about at
The
all.
walkway, let me see if I can describe this differently.
I think the point is that some designs may no longer be allowable. And I'm trying to teach you all to think about the separation between vehicles and pedestrians and make them separate so that it does work for people with visual impairments. I had a wonderful conversation several years ago with a gentleman who teaches people how to cane navigate. And he told me that they definitely can tell the difference between asphalt and concrete. So the sense of touch is there, and that difference in material does resonate up through the cane. Same with detectable warnings. They can feel the difference. But we want to be more consistent and not rely on asphalt to concrete, because if you think about all the places where there's an asphalt to concrete transition, it may already be too late. I mean, how many times have you seen the 2 accessible parking spaces done in concrete and the rest of the parking facility is asphalt? So we want to make sure that the pedestrian areas are raised and or separated, and that there's a warning before the person heads into a vehicular area.
Bill Zellner. There's Bill Zellner on the line who looks like he wants to ask a question.
Oh, okay, great. Hi, Bill.
Hey, Michelle, how are you?
I'm good.
Great presentation. I've got one question. So, you know, I work in healthcare. We get a lot of injuries of people stepping off of curbs. So I'm trying to design our covered drop-offs, kind of similar to a lot of hotel covered drop-off areas where we use a blended transition. And so the question is that 4-inch requirement, am I still obligated to have the building floor 4 inches above the drive aisle as I use a blended transition to connect the two? Or can I make it 2 inches? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and a blended transition could be used. A lot of your facilities, Bill, I know are existing construction. And so that's where,
When I design them new though, I don't want to design a place where people are going to trip. As you can imagine, it's embarrassing for a healthcare facility to create places where people get injured.
yeah, and I think that perhaps there's just going to have to be a little bit more thought put into those drop-off areas. Quite a few of them are very close to the building, and they may need to have just a little more separation between the people and the vehicles. So
So
I
do we
don't
have to
have
have a
an answer
4-inch,
per
the
se,
4-inch requirement is specifically if we do use a blended transition.
no, the 4-inch requirement is specifically for a circulation path that's contiguous to a vehicle area.
Okay.
And then you can have a blended transition or a curb ramp that cuts into that, those two to provide the transition space so that you can change levels.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Do we have any other questions?
Well, there was also another question in the chat asking how big of a gap would be necessary to separate vehicle area and a pedestrian area? Is it a 1/2 inch, 12 inches, 36 inches? What are you talking about there? It's from Craig Williams.
A horizontal gap?
That's what I believe so, because prior to this, you were speaking about rather than having, you know, a raised area that's 4 inches, you could have like a horizontal I guess gap between the vehicular area and the circulation path. What constitutes that gap? Is it, you know, 12 inches, 36 inches? What does that mean exactly?
Well, that wasn't defined, and it could intentionally be different for different sites. I don't see a scenario where a 1/2 inch is really going to be paint detectable and provide safety, but there is no defined amount. And in existing conditions, that could vary. Again, it's going to be a bit of a judgment call on the part of the designers. What constitutes a safe circulation area?
Okay, great. There's another one here. It says, from Jeff G, are detectable warnings allowed within the no parking striped area of accessible parking? I have a situation where accessible parking has a drive aisle contiguous with it. Detectable warnings are required before entering drive aisles and parking structure, but are not allowed in no parking areas.
Detectable warnings are not allowed in drive aisles either. So if it's a vehicular area, drive aisle, a driveway, the transitional access areas, there are no detectable warnings allowed.
Keep on scrolling. Give me 1 second. Okay, this is from Michael Shook. We had a meeting with Derek Shaw, DSA. He agreed that if there's no flush curb with vehicular way, then the deed of driveways will serve as the separation, no raised walk.
And could you read that again?
Yeah, okay, sure. So we had a meeting with someone over from DSA, and he agreed that if there is a flush curb with a vehicular way, then the driveways will serve as the separation and no raised walk. I think you already agreed to this one in one of your examples, Michelle, where you're basically just showing a sidewalk that crossed the driveway. And I believe that's what he's getting at here.
Yeah, if this is the sidewalk at the public right of way where it crosses the driveway, then correct, there would be no detectable warnings there. Because it's just a driveway without stop or yield control. And that is in that exception that it's not required. That's what I was talking about with the photo of all the driveways going down the street. You don't want detectable warnings at every single driveway.
No, but I think the comment was that, it doesn't have to be separated by a raised elevation. It could be flush at those points.
Well, the driveway obviously needs to cross the public right of way. So yes, at crossings, we expect vehicles and pedestrians to be at the same level.
Okay, Michelle, we got another one here from Sam J. Says the updated code has a separation requirement, parallel curb ramp between the driveway and the back of walk. Is there a similar requirement between the driveway and the door at the hotel example that was discussed previously?
I didn't give a hotel example, so I'm not familiar with what he's referring to.
This is a tough one. Yeah, I think we might skip that one, but I think you addressed it in answering Bill Zomer's question. So that
Let me say this again. In existing facilities, there's going to be some very difficult, very specific conditions where you don't know what to do. And we have the same issue at DSA as a jurisdictional entity when we do the plan reviews for the schools. And so at those locations, talk to the authority having jurisdiction, talk to the building official, get buy-in and agreement on how to handle it, because existing facilities could provide you some challenges. There are going to be constraints. So this section was written with new construction in mind, with some exceptions for existing facilities. So that's probably the best point to remember.
Thanks, Michelle. I think that's pretty much all the questions, and we're pretty much out of time at this point. So thank you for your presentation. It was great. Always informative.